there's a stream that comes into Lake Champlain at Ticonderoga, which is the exit of Lake George, which is about 200 feet higher than Lake Champlain. So you can portage 3 miles up a rapids to Lake George, and you could sail down Lake George to Fort George, which is at the south end of Lake George, and there's a primitive military road that goes to Fort Edward, and a portage of about 7 miles to the Hudson River again. Or you could sail up the St. Lawrence River to Lake Ontario, cross Lake Ontario to Fort Oswego, which is on the kind of like the southeast border of Lake Ontario, and up the Oswego River, which drains Oneida Lake. And you can cross Oneida Lake and you enter a different Wood Creek, and you can sail up Wood Creek to a portage of about a mile on flat land, where you then can portage to the origin of the Mohawk River, which runs from central New York State east and joins the Hudson River just above Albany. So these are the highways of the water routes of the Northeast at that particular time. In a little quick history, in 1765, the Stamp Act was instituted by the British government to help pay for the French and Indian Wars. That was not well received in the colonies, and it was repealed about a year later in 1766. Also in 1765 was the Quartering Act, which the British government demanded that the colonists basically pay for the quartering of British troops in private homes. This was not well received either. Then in 1767, the Townshend Act was passed by Parliament, and the Townshend Act taxed a variety of commodities, including glass, tea, paper, paint, and lead. It was initially designed to raise taxes, again, to pay for the military in the colonies, but about a year later, Townshend himself decided that we needed to keep the governors of the colonies and the judges in the colonies in favor of British law, and so the money raised by the Townshend Act taxes went to pay judges and governors to keep them loyal to Britain. Now, the products that were taxed were not produced in the United States for the most part, and the colonies had to import these, and the only place they could import them from was Britain. Most of the Townshend Act taxes were repealed, but it was the anger over the Townshend Act that sparked the Boston Massacre in 1770. Like Boston, New York City also objected to the tax on tea. Most of the Townshend Acts eventually were repealed, except for the tax on tea. And a similar group, known as the Liberty Boys, held their own tea party in New York City, but they held it during the day and without Indian disguises. It was a few months after that, in the spring of 1775, when the fighting occurs at Lexington and Concord. The Battle of Breed's Hill or Bunker Hill will follow about a month later in June of 1775, and that's followed by the siege of Boston, where George Washington and the army that he's raised will surround Boston and try and block the British from leaving the Boston area. But they don't have heavy artillery to discourage the British in Boston. In the spring of 1775, Ticonderoga was also captured by
Okay, everybody.
Let me get my,
We're going to call an audible because we're having technical difficulties with the video. So what I'm going to do is give Matt the video so he can go over with you. You won't see the pretty pictures that he spent so much time. But for some reason, this little thumb drive that you brought us isn't like fully engaged. It just shows up and goes away. Whoops, it shows up and goes away on every screen. So I am sorry that this has happened, but this is technology. And I am going to plug this in over here and we'll hopefully.
I got an extension.
Yeah. I'm going to move the table back.
Yeah, that's totally.
There. Okay, so we're going to do this. So I guess you are going to see pretty pictures. Let me get this.
Don't put me in yet. Yeah, don't put this in yet. This is better.
Honestly, folks, most of the time this stuff works, and I apologize. But I'm glad to see a big crowd today. That's wonderful. Dr. Matt Farina puts so much time and effort into these projects, and I know some of the faces look familiar, so I'm sure you can attest to the fact that he puts so much time and effort and all the different things that he does as far as correlating pieces of history that you wouldn't even think connect. And we do have to kill that. Okay. Yep. Okay. You watch yourself now. Yeah. Matt, how about you sit for this one? And we're going to put you over there. You don't have to trip over the wires.
All right.
Notes.
We can actually do the lights also.
Yeah, we'll definitely do that. So all right.
This is the water route we were talking about earlier. Canada's up here, the St. Lawrence River's up here. This is the Richelieu River into Upper Champlain Lake. This is the continuation of Champlain Lake. And about at this level here is Fort Ticonderoga. This is the narrow portion of Lake Champlain. The portages are here. This is the Hudson River. Albany's about here, down to New York City. Here's West Point here. And this is the overall picture. So, whoops, we'll go back. So the portages here, Hudson River. This is Lake George paralleling the lower portion of the lake. a second way you could portage to reach the Hudson River. There's the Mohawk River just above Albany, draining central New York State. This is the second Wood Creek, and this is where the great carrying place, as it was known to the Indians, was Oneida Lake. The exit from Oneida Lake is a river that runs north to Oswego, Lake Ontario, St. Lawrence River. Now, there were large sailing ships, but the commonest vessel that was used were different sizes of what were called bateaus. They could be as small as carry 12 men to as long as carrying 30 men and actually carrying artillery that was broken down. Here's the proclamation line I was talking about. So the colonists were not supposed to cross this proclamation line to the other side of the Appalachians because they didn't want to spark repeat Indian wars, which then the British government would need to provide protection for the colonists for, incurring more debt to add to the debt from the 7 Years' War. Boston Massacre, we talked about. The Tea Party in December of 1773. Lexington and Concord occur in April 1775. A month later, Ethan Allen and a man I'm going to be talking about repeatedly, Benedict Arnold, was working with Ethan Allen in the capture of Fort Ticonderoga from the British. The Battle of Bunker Hill or Breed's Hill occurs about a month later in June, and the siege of Boston begins. With the capture of Fort Ticonderoga and its cannon, Henry Knox realized, and George Washington realized, that artillery was necessary in Boston. So in the winter of 1775, starting roughly in December to most of February, Knox will move about 46 cannon and about 16 mortars that were captured at Ticonderoga down to Albany, across the Hudson River, and over the Great Road through Massachusetts to Boston. When the British wake up in March of 1776, they see cannon now surrounding Boston. And with that, the British realize they need to evacuate Boston. And that will occur in May of 1776. 100 British ships will remove soldiers and civilians who want to leave Boston, take them either back to London or to Halifax. Now, also occurring in the winter of 1775, while Henry Knox is moving the artillery from Ticonderoga to Boston, the Continental Congress decides to invade Canada. We can't call it the United States yet, but the Continental Congress feels that the French in Canada, Quebec occupying what is today almost a third of Canada, heavily French population, not satisfied with the British control. The British control Montreal and Quebec City primarily. So the hope is that Canada will join the colonies, the 13 colonies, become the 14th colony to fight against the British. So 2 American armies will invade Canada. Leaving from Fort Ticonderoga is one army under the command of General Richard Montgomery, He will lead an army north from Ticonderoga to capture the village of Montreal at that point in time. Again, Benedict Arnold will take a larger force, leave Boston, move through Massachusetts in the dead of winter to attack Quebec City. Montreal falls to Montgomery, but by the time he captures Montreal, combination of disease and military losses, he has a force of only 300 men left to join Benedict Arnold's force, which had about 1,500 men when it left, but by the time they get through the Maine and Canadian wilderness to Quebec City, Arnold's force is reduced to about 675 men. They decide to attack Quebec City on December 31st, New Year's Eve, in 1775 during a snowstorm. Montgomery is killed, Benedict Arnold is wounded, and the garrison at Quebec City under the command of General Guy Carleton is able to hold out against the inferior American force. Arnold, however, will decide to try a siege to force the British out of Quebec City. This is Colonel Benedict Arnold at this point. In the spring of 1776, Benjamin Franklin will leave New York City on a secret mission to go to Canada. He has been sent there by the Continental Congress with two other delegates, and they've been given wide authority by the Continental Congress to attempt to form a union with the French-Canadian people. He arrives there in April of 1776, reaches Montreal, and Benedict Arnold and the remnants of the American Army. The Continental Congress, much like Congress today, sent Benjamin Franklin there to do this with no finances. The French-Canadian people have been supporting the American Army there, and Arnold has been paying them in promises, and Benjamin Franklin arrives with no gold. So with that, any attempt at union is lost. The French creditors are upset with the American Army and Benedict Arnold, and Arnold decides to abandon the siege and take the remnants of the diseased American Army back up Lake Champlain to Fort Ticonderoga. Guy Carleton, the commander of British forces in Quebec City, feels that this is a perfect time to follow up this retreating, diseased American Army, and he has plans, submits plans to capture Ticonderoga again and to proceed down and capture the capital of New York State, Albany. But Carleton needs ships to move on Lake Champlain, and unfortunately for Carleton, this is Carleton. We'll stop here. Unfortunately for Carleton, General Howe has priority over Carleton. And General Howe plans to take a force of 31,000 British and move them from Halifax to New York City. George Washington, after the British left the Boston area, realizes that the British will probably make an attempt to capture New York City because there's a large Tory population that lives in southern New York colony at that point in time. So Washington has moved the army to the New York City area onto Long Island, and General Howe has control over the British fleet to move forces primarily from Halifax to land them on Long Island. The British will overwhelm Washington's army on Long Island, and through a series of reversals and retreats, drive Washington's army out of Long Island through the island of Manhattan, with the loss of Forts Washington and Lee on both sides of the Hudson River, and force the American army into New Jersey. Finally, it isn't until the fall of 1776 that General Carleton up in Quebec City gets the fleet available to him to move his forces up Lake Champlain. And so he starts that move. He changes his plan. It's fall. He's not going to have enough time to make it all the way down to Albany, but his plan is to capture Fort Ticonderoga for the fall campaign of 1776, and then proceed to Albany the following year. The delay has allowed General Schuyler, who is in command of colonial forces in upstate New York, and Benedict Arnold again, to build a fleet of ships at Skenesboro, which is at the southern end of the southern end of Lake Champlain. They will build a fleet of gunboats and sailing vessels in the period of time that Carleton is waiting for his ships in Boston. They know the British are going to be coming up lake, and at the Battle of Valcour Island, this is an old map of Valcour Island, Benedict Arnold, leading the American fleet, will stymie the British initially. Some people consider Skenesboro, now Whitehall, New York, the birthplace of the American Navy. That would make Benedict Arnold the father of the American Navy. That doesn't fit well with the United States Navy. The Navy considers its birthplace as Philadelphia because the first 4 ships built for the Navy were built in Philadelphia after the Continental Congress formed the Navy. They argue technically that Arnold was an Army commander of a naval fleet, and therefore was not the United States Navy. There are several other places that claim birthplace of the United States Navy, including a place in Maine, where a bunch of sailors captured a British sloop and did some raiding with it, and they say they were the American Navy birthplace. And there are a couple of other places in Massachusetts that claim the same, but the official Navy force is Philadelphia for the birthplace. Lest you think that Arnold fought this with bateaus, these were sizable sailing vessels. This is the British fleet attacking the American fleet at the south end of Valcour Island. This is a map of the area. Valcour Island, I can get the pointer here, pick the right one. There's Valcour Island. Arnold puts his fleet, the British are coming down the main channel through the lake. Arnold puts his fleet across the other side of the island and sends out a couple of boats to attract attention to the British fleet. And the British fleet sail around, and the American fleet is waiting for them. And the engagement begins here. The British inflict sizable casualties on the American fleet before nightfall occurs. The plan is to resume the battle the next day. The British basically anchor here. A number of Indians that are accompanying the fleet put ashore here to prevent the Americans from escaping on the west shore of Lake Champlain. And of course, the fleet is blocking the waterway. When morning arrives, the Americans are no longer there. And the British assume that during the night, during the night, there we go. During the night, they sailed north around Valcour Island. So the British send part of their fleet to chase the Americans. The other part of the fleet, they sail around the end of Valcour Island to intercept the Americans. This takes several days to do this because the prevailing winds have now shifted. But as it turns out, the American fleet did not sail north. In effect, Arnold abandoned the fleet, the damaged vessels, and during the night in the gunboats, they rowed the boats along the shoreline between the fires that the Indians had started on the New York side shore and the British fleet. So Arnold escapes with his sailors down to Crown Point and to Fort Ticonderoga. The delay that he inflicts on the British is substantial because after the Battle of Valcour Island, a number of storms begin to occur in the Northeast, and the British fleet is significantly delayed 20 more days before they can effectively move down to Crown Point, which is 10 miles north of Fort Ticonderoga. By now, we're well into fall. These are the fall storms that are occurring, and Carleton decides we can't supply my force at Crown Point. We don't have enough manpower to attack Ticonderoga and hold it and bring in supplies from Canada. So Carleton abandons the plan and retreats back to Quebec City, which is fortunate for the Americans because the American force defending Fort Ticonderoga was small, and the fort would have easily fallen to Carleton's forces. So Benedict Arnold, in effect, saves the campaign, blocks the British campaign, and saves Ticonderoga in the fall of 1776. Now, while Carleton's campaign is going on, and before he retreats back to Quebec City in November, newly knighted General William Howe, who has defeated Washington in Long Island and Manhattan, is knighted because of the victories. And he submits an ambitious plan to end the war in 1777. His plan is that Carleton will resume his plan to occupy Albany by the fall. Howe proposes to the British government a two-pronged attack, one from Rhode Island to take Boston, a second prong up the Hudson River to combine with Carleton's force coming down from Canada. Howe will also have a third force operate in New Jersey, primarily to hold Washington in place, threaten Philadelphia, but really not try to capture Philadelphia. Howe assumed that this would discourage the French from providing any aid to the Americans and would demoralize the colonists. He submitted plans for this requiring roughly 35,000 men. I guess I have to aim it. Yeah. Let's do it this way. I know that works. Nothing seems to be working today. And I'll use my own pointer. So this is Howe's plan to end the war. He's going to have 10,000 men move up the Hudson River, 5,000 to hold New York City, 10,000 to attack Boston, 2,000 will remain to hold his supply route through Rhode Island, and 8,000 to hold Washington in place by threatening Philadelphia. That's the original plan, and he sends this and the request back to Britain. Well, it takes 4 to 6 weeks for ships to sail back to Britain, crossing the Atlantic. Before his first message and first request gets there, Howe changes the plan. And why does he change the plan? He changes the plan because he chases Washington across New Jersey, and it appears that the revolution is collapsing. So Howe decides, I don't need this many men. We don't want to tax the British government more with unnecessary troops. I'm going to go right to Philadelphia, capture Philadelphia, and end the revolution. So in December, a few weeks after his initial plan was sent, he sends another ship with the revised plan. And in the revised plan, he's just going to have a few men holding the Hudson River in New York City. Forget Boston. We'll hold Rhode Island primarily as a seaport, and we'll take 10,000 men to Philadelphia, capture Philadelphia, and end the war. And that message goes out. Going to take 4 to 6 weeks to get to London. Well, what happens on December 26th is Washington pulls off the miracle at Trenton, and then that's followed a few days later with the victory at the Battle of Princeton, and things change. With those two victories, the French begin to believe that perhaps something is possible, and there's concern that the French may now begin to provide more support for the Americans. Howe sends a revised third plan back to Boston, asking for more men, but he's still going to go after Philadelphia. He feels that capturing Philadelphia will end the revolution. In December of 1776, another man goes to Philadelphia, and that is, there's Washington crossing the Delaware. Major General John Burgoyne will arrive in England from Quebec City. He had served under Carleton in Quebec City during Benedict Arnold's attempt to capture the city. Burgoyne will meet with Lord George Germain, who's responsible for Britain's immense colonial empire. Germain regarded it as his prerogative to give his commanders very detailed instructions on how to conduct their campaigns. He had no real comprehension or understanding of the distances and the natural obstacles involved in fighting a war in the colonies. But he was also very interested in the ambitious Burgoyne because, as Germain said, I like this man because he has a fire in his belly. Germain and the young George III saw eye to eye on how to eliminate the American situation. Both wanted to go for the jugular. The king expressed regret for the great expense that would be necessary to subdue the Americans, but what was at issue was the honor of the crown and the honor of the rights of Parliament to tax. The national debt had been staggering after the 7 Years' War, and Englishmen were already heavily taxed. And the English people supported the king in this because they felt the Americans had benefited hugely from the victory over France and should bear their fair share of the resulting financial burden. Burgoyne had entered the army at the age of 15 and quickly acquired a taste for gambling, convivial drinking, skills at card playing, and womanizing. Due to his wife's family, he was given command of the 11th Light Dragoons, and he hit upon the idea first of a recruitment poster to get more men to join the dragoons. And he was successful in raising basically 2 additional regiments. He encouraged his officers to treat their men as, quote, thinking beings and not as, quote, spaniels. His troopers were soon calling him Gentleman Johnny as a term of genuine fondness. Militarily, most British officers had a low estimation of the Americans as fighters. They felt they were raw, undisciplined, cowardly men. But a few disagreed, including Burgoyne. Burgoyne had studied his enemy in Canada and wrote an impressive study which was submitted to the cabinet. He advocated the use of mobile battalions of infantry and artillery to root out rebels from their hiding places where every American soldier was, this is his quote, his own general, who would turn every tree and bush into a kind of temporary fortress from whence, when he has fired his shot with all the deliberation, coolness, and certainty which hidden safety inspires, he will skip, as it were, to the next, and so on for a long time until dislodged either by cannon or by a resolute attack by light infantry, unquote. Burgoyne sketched out a plan of action that was to be the basis of the campaign in 1777, recommending that an army in New York City head north and join forces with an army moving south from Canada. This would utilize the Hudson Lake Champlain waterways and would sever New England from the rest of the country. This was not an original plan since others had proposed it, but the king had decided that Burgoyne should command the corps to be sent from Canada to Albany. Now, to distract the American attention, a diversionary force would march up the St. Lawrence River across Lake Ontario to Oswego to the Mohawk River, eventually joining with the Canadian Army and Howe in Albany. So this was the plan, Burgoyne's plan. General Howe was still going to follow his plan to capture Philadelphia. So this is all part of the same campaign. In March of 1777, Lord Germain informed Guy Carleton in Canada that he was to command the remaining army in the defense of Canada. Carleton was to supply Burgoyne with half the army, some 7,000 men, the German mercenaries, and as many Canadians and Indians that may be thought necessary, and all the stores and artillery that Burgoyne felt he needed. Burgoyne was to proceed to Albany, where he would put himself under the command of Sir William Howe, General Howe. After writing out these very detailed orders, Lord Germain was impatient to get to his country home for the spring, but his secretary reminded him that no specific information had yet been written for General Howe. Now, it's unknown whether there was a missing dispatch. Howe claimed that all he received was a copy of the letter that Lord Germain had sent to Carleton, and in 8 letters subsequent to that letter, later sent by Germain to Howe between the dates of March 3rd and April 19th, never once did he refer to Burgoyne's expedition or what was expected from Howe in way of cooperation. Howe's total knowledge of the joint operation was from Germain's letter to Carleton, where Burgoyne was to, quote, put himself under the command of Sir William Howe, unquote, and should, quote, never lose sight, unquote, of the junction with Howe that was his, quote, principal objective, unquote. Germain's letter of May 18th to Howe stated his trust that Howe would not permit the Philadelphia campaign to jeopardize the Northern expedition's success. Now that letter, which kind of put the emphasis on Burgoyne's campaign as maybe the more important of the two, that letter reached Howe, even though it was sent in April, reached Howe on August 16th, too late to influence any actions that Howe would take. However, Howe certainly was aware of the general plan and had been in communication with Burgoyne himself to inform him that Washington's army had sent General Sullivan and 2,500 men north to Albany, and that should Washington move his entire force following General Sullivan up to Albany, that he, Howe, would chase Washington's army upstate New York and crush Washington between his force and Burgoyne's force coming down from Canada. So Howe was aware of Burgoyne's actions in Canada, moving down to Albany, and had sent him intelligence that part of Washington's army was being diverted to Albany. Unbeknownst to Lord Germain, Howe changed his mind again. This would be a fourth time. And on April 2nd, he decided to remove his troops from New Jersey and add them to his field army and sail to Philadelphia. Now, if you look at the map here, and this is something that historians have argued about, here's New York City, here's Philadelphia. The crow flies the shortest route between the two cities. So the overland route, marching your army from New York City to Philadelphia, would be the shortest route. Instead, Howe has decided to board ships, sail all the way down to Fortress Monroe, up the Chesapeake Bay to land at Head of Elk, and then march overland to capture Philadelphia. When Howe does this, he puts himself out of communication with his headquarters in New York City, and he can't even have ground communication by horseback messenger because Washington positions himself between New York City and Philadelphia, to unknown to Washington what Howe is planning. So Washington keeps himself between Philadelphia and New York City, in effect blocking land communication between Howe and New York City. And of course, any communications from London are going to go to New York City. So Howe's out of touch with London, out of touch with his headquarters in New York City. Howe had developed this plan to occupy Philadelphia, and he was unwilling to recognize that the capture of the city, beyond its possible psychological impact, could not itself determine the outcome of the war. In strategic and in geographic terms, it led to nowhere. To win, he had to destroy Washington's army. Now, this message, being that I'm a Civil War buff, this is the same message that the Union Army doesn't recognize under McClellan. In the Civil War, where McClellan feels the goal should be to capture Richmond, not destroy Lee's army. It will take the Americans another war to figure that out. You go after the enemy's army, not the enemy's cities. Burgoyne arrived in Canada in early May 1777. Here's a portrait of Burgoyne. And Carleton cooperated with him, and the Northern Army was divided into three elements. Lieutenant Colonel Barry Ledger was given a detachment of 200 regulars, 200 provincials, 400 Germans, 500 Indians, for a total of 1,200 men that he would lead across Lake Ontario to Oswego against Fort Stanwix at the head of the Mohawk River. Some 3,500 men would remain in Canada with Carleton's army, and the lion's share of the Northern Army, some 9,000 men, would go with Burgoyne. Germain had answered Howe's letter indicating that the king had approved the move to Philadelphia, but that whatever Howe elected to do, it should be executed in time to cooperate with Burgoyne's army. Germain, as I said earlier, was oblivious to the distances involved and the primitive conditions of roads in the wilderness, and the impossibility of Howe sailing to Philadelphia, capturing the city, and still having time to rendezvous with Burgoyne. Burgoyne's plan required that he move as soon as possible in the spring, but he soon discovered the vulnerability of his supply line. Now, every soldier, every weapon, every button, every bit of food had to be carried to the Americas on a ship. The transatlantic crossing took a staggering 11% loss of men and ships in crossing. So more than 10% of the supplies would be, and a fleet sailing would be lost at sea. Even though Burgoyne was going to move by ships, you still needed wheel carts to haul ammunition on the primary roads and the portages between bodies of water. There were very few oxen in Canada, and there were even fewer carts in Canada. And this concept was to have a deleterious logistical and tactical consequence. Burgoyne's army left Fort St. John in Canada, boarded their ships and barges, and sailed south on Lake Champlain and debarked on June 25th and 26th at the abandoned Fort Crown Point. This is an old map of Fort Crown Point. It was a fort that the French had actually built in the French and Indian Wars, along with the fort at Ticonderoga. If you go there today, much of that fort still remains. This is a modern picture of the barracks at Fort Crown Point. So the first part of the mission has no problems at all. Now, Fort Ticonderoga is about 10 miles further south from Crown Point, and Ticonderoga has been called the Gibraltar of the North. It had been built by the French as a star-shaped Fort Carillon in 1755 during the French and Indian Wars. The British had captured it and renamed it Ticonderoga. It regained significance when captured by Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys and Benedict Arnold in May of 1775. Its defenses after that were enlarged and strengthened. It's on a promontory 3/4 of a mile long that projects out into Lake Champlain's western shore and guards the 1 mile long gorge that carries Lake George water into Lake Champlain. It also guards the 3/4 of a mile passage between the upper and lower portions of the lake, which is a relatively narrowed area with Crown Point at one end and Ticonderoga at the other. The fort itself sits 70 feet above the lake. Once through the passage into the narrow southern portion of the lake, one can sail to the boat yards in Skeensboro. And as I said, from there, up Wood Creek, excuse me, to within a few miles of the Hudson River. This is a bird's eye view of the fort. We're looking south, so this is the southern end of the lake. Across a narrow area here, where a boom of logs and chains will be placed by the colonists to prevent the British from sailing down to the lower end of the lake, and a boat bridge. This is Mount Independence. There's at the time of the American Revolution, there was a fort here, a small mountain. Back here is Mount Defiance, about 750 feet tall. And this is the water coming from Lake George down rapids and flowing into Lake Champlain. So here's Ticonderoga, Fort Independence, Mount Independence, just a few battery positions here. Here's the boom of logs and chains to prevent the fleet from sailing through. And here's the bridge of boats, which allows men to walk across the narrow portion of the lake here from Ticonderoga to Fort Independence. This is Mount Defiance. 10 miles up this way is Crown Point. The Americans were ill-prepared to defend the fort against Burgoyne. The new commander of the fort, Major St. Clair, had too few men to man all the defenses. He had about 2,300 effectives. To abandon the fort was unthinkable, but to lose his force in a forlorn hope was also unthinkable, since if the force at Ticonderoga were captured or destroyed, there were only 700 Continental soldiers manning various stockades between Ticonderoga and Albany at the time. St. Clair decided to evacuate the sick, some of the garrison's cannon, and all but 1,500 effectives to Fort George on the south end of Lake George. If Ticonderoga's defenders failed to repel the attack, they would need to immediately retreat while the retreat corridor remained open. And that retreat would be most likely over that bridge to Fort Independence. General Philip Schuyler, who was in command of all forces in New York State, met with St. Clair and his staff and decided on the inevitable strategy. And then Schuyler left to plead with George Washington for more reinforcements. Burgoyne landed his force and placed the Germans on the east shore and the British forces on the west shore. Fraser's corps, the British, moved within a mile of the Mount Hope defenses, which were defenses left over from the French and Indian Wars up in this area. And the few soldiers there fired a few shots and abandoned those defenses and retreated to Ticonderoga. All that occurred on July 2nd. On July 3rd, there was sporadic artillery fire, but no casualties. On July 4th, the British cut a road and occupied the top of Mount Defiance. And from Fort Ticonderoga, St. Clair could see the British were building a gun emplacement up there. That same day, July 4th, while the battery was being built, 900 reinforcements arrived for General St. Clair. But on the 5th, he saw that the guns were being moved up there. To give you an idea of what that looked like, this is the view from Mount Defiance. And we're looking down, it's about 1,700 yards to Fort Ticonderoga. This is the river coming in from Lake George. This is the narrow portion from the upper and lower lake. Fort Independence is out of view. It would be over here. The boom of logs was in this position here. And if you go, there's a road that goes up there today, and this is the view that you get. They have a few cannon up there to give you an idea of what that would look like. Well, once Germain saw the guns up there, he had a war council that night, and he and his staff agreed to retreat that night. 2 schooners, a sloop, and over 200 bateaux were available to transport supplies and the sick and men to man those boats down to Skenesboro. The rest of the army was to march across the bridge and march by road on the Vermont side of the lake. The retreat over the bridge was masked by continuous cannon fire from the fort. Once they arrived at Fort Independence, they fired the fort, and by morning, when the British noted the cannon fire had stopped, and the British basically walked into Fort Ticonderoga. They rushed to the bridge, realizing that the Americans had escaped to begin pursuit. Now, 4 gunners were left by St. Clair to man several cannon that covered that boat bridge, and they were to fire grape shot over that to prevent the British from coming over the bridge. Unfortunately, those 4 gunners found the whiskey stores that were left at Fort Independence, and they were drunk at the time. So the British came across the bridge readily and captured what was left of Fort Independence. It would be 2 years later that St. Clair, who was hated by most people because he had abandoned Ticonderoga, St. Clair and Schuyler were court-martialed, but they were both cleared because the actions that they took had basically saved the army. Now, leaving part of his force at Ticonderoga, Burgoyne began pursuit of the retreating American column, which was struggling along a primitive road in the heat. Colonel Ebenezer Francis's 11th Massachusetts Regiment formed the rear guard as the 2 Continental and 4 militia regiments moved southward towards Hubbardton, Vermont. When St. Clair reached Hubbardton, he left Colonel Nathan Hale and the 2nd New Hampshire Regiment and Colonel Seth Warner's battalion of Green Mountain Men to support Ebenezer's 11th Massachusetts as the rear guard. The reinforced rear guard comprised roughly a third of St. Clair's army, and then St. Clair took the remaining 2/3 of his army and moved down the road from Hubbardton into Vermont. So here's Ticonderoga up here. Remember, going down the lake is the fleet and the 200 bateaux and supplies and some cannon. The rest of the army crossed over to Fort Independence, and they're following this crude road. Here's Hubbardton, a little, very, very small village, and that's where the rear guard, which was supposed to follow the regular army, but because the rear guard, the weather was so hot and the rear guard was so exhausted that they camped overnight at Hubbardton. St. Clair will take his forces down into Vermont in this direction. Seth Warner and Ebenezer Francis put up a defensive position at Hubbardton to cover the road coming from Fort Independence, as well as another road coming from Lake George directly. The British force under Fraser, along with a German force, camped within a couple miles of the colonial force. During the night, the Indians with the British had scouted the American position, and Fraser attacked in the morning. When he attacked, he caught Nathan Hale and his New Hampshire men at breakfast, and Hale himself was captured, and much of his force evaporated into the woods. Fraser then attacked the remaining rear guard. So here's Francis with his Massachusetts men and Warner with his Green Mountain men here. Fraser attacks and is attempting to flank the American position. The Americans were ready and opened up a withering fire on the British 29th and 34th regiments as they came up the hill, driving them back. The British then attacked a second time, and hoping to turn Warner's flank and cut off the escape route down the Castleton Road. But in a maneuver worthy of a professionally trained soldier, Warner refused his flank. That is, he bent his flank back and prevented the British from outflanking him. At the same time, on the opposite end, Francis ordered a bayonet charge, kind of reminiscent of what we will see in the Civil War at the Little Round Top. And this caught the British by surprise and drove the British down. Fraser's well-conceived offensive plan failed, and his last hope was to use the Germans who had come up during the fighting. General Rudessel, or Dessel, I guess is the way it's pronounced, had seen what was happening and moved his men into position. And with their band playing and his men singing and firing by platoon, moved to overlap the American right. The 11th Massachusetts fell back, and Francis was killed, and with his death, the 11th Massachusetts gave up the position and disappeared into the woods. Realizing that the fight was over, Warner and his Vermont men also evaporated into the wilderness. Bruce Venter, who was a member of my Northern Civil War Roundtable, published a book several years ago about the battle at Hubbardton. He titled it The Battle of Hubbardton, the Rearguard Action That Saved America. The fight had basically stopped the British column and allowed St. Clair to escape with 2/3 of his army. And that army that St. Clair managed to escape with will come into action again in a few months at Saratoga. There's a small museum there. This is a diorama in the museum. Meanwhile, on the southern end of the lake, Colonel Long, who was in command of the American fleet, sailed unhurriedly towards Skenesboro, secure in the belief that the British gunboats would be blocked by the boom of logs for several days. But within a few hours, British gunboats had smashed the boom, and with a few well-placed cannon shot. The Americans landed at 1 p.m. on July 6th, and 4 p.m., the British were just 3 miles away. Burgoyne landed 3 regiments on the east shore of the lake with orders to move south and block Wood Creek to prevent the Americans from escaping. Then Burgoyne launched his attack on Skenesboro. Colonel Long knew that the stockade was too weak to withstand an assault, so he burned the fort, most of the fleet, and sent the invalids and women up Wood Creek. The rough terrain delayed the British regiments from reaching Wood Creek and blocking it, so Long and his force were able to escape to Fort Anne. A British regiment was sent in pursuit, but could only make 10 miles on July 7th because the roads were so poor, and the Americans had destroyed many of the crude bridges over the many streams there. When the Americans arrived at Fort Anne, they fired Fort Anne and retreated to Fort Edward. Now, since Burgoyne occupied Skenesboro, Burgoyne decided to pause here, consolidate his forces, congratulate his men, and decide what he was going to do next to reach the Hudson. He had basically 3 or 4 options. He could return back to Fort Ticonderoga, 36 miles up, portage all his bateau, cannon, and supplies up the gorge to Lake George, which is, as I said, 220 feet higher than Lake Champlain, and the portage would be 3 miles. Sail south down Lake George to Fort George, some 39 miles, and then portage from Lake George to Fort Edward on the Hudson River. So one route is to go back to Ticonderoga, come down Lake George, Fort George. This is the road to Fort Edward down here. There are falls in the Hudson River at this point, so you have to. Where you can really put boats back into the Hudson River is at Fort Edward down here. A second route is to he's at Skeensboro here, is to cut over through a very primitive road to Lake George here, put boats in the water at this point, and the same thing. A third option is to continue up Wood Creek to Fort Ann. There's a crude military road from Fort Ann to Fort Edward. Take that and move the Army that way. He makes the decision to move from Skeensboro up Wood Creek, some 23 miles, to within a few miles of Fort Ann for the portage to Fort Ann, and then over that military road to Fort Edward. The worst part of that being a 3-mile stretch that required constructing a causeway. Burgoyne made that decision and started that move, arriving at Fort Ann on July 29th. He decided to abandon or leave at Ticonderoga many of the cannon. He had brought a 138 cannon with him, but he reduced that to 43 cannon after Ticonderoga was captured. The artillery would be burdensome in this move, but he felt it was necessary to balance his smaller number of trained infantry against the larger number of American militia. He sends part of his supply route back to Ticonderoga, and he uses captured American prisoners to move the bateau the 3 miles up to Lake George, and so his supplies come down from Lake George to Fort George, and then on the military road. Now, while at Skeensboro, Burgoyne. While he's making his move, General Schuyler has moved into the area, and Schuyler orders a number of men on Wood Creek to fell trees across the creek. And this substantially delays the British from moving their forces up the creek in bateaus. Now, while at Skeensboro, Burgoyne receives Indian help, and I put quotes around the word help, on July 20th. Instead of the 500 warriors a Frenchman was paid to recruit, the Frenchman brought in 150 outcasts intent on murder and looting. Burgoyne and his officers could not control them. Now, this was shown in the infamous murder of Jane McCrae when an Indian band arrived at Frazier's camp with captives and a scalp. The scalp was from the head of Jane or Jenny McCrae. Jane had come north from New Jersey to live with her brother, who was a colonel in the 13th Regiment of the Albany County Militia. Her fiancé was a neighbor who was a lieutenant in the Loyalist Peters Corps, which was serving under Burgoyne. When the colonel, when her brother, the colonel, moved his family to safety in Albany, Jane elected to stay in Fort Edward at the home of Mrs. McNeil, who was possibly Jenny's aunt, to await her lover. Samuel Standish was a military man on picket duty at Fort Edward who was captured by the British, by the Indians who were bringing him to the British, and he was in that as a prisoner in that Indian raiding party. On July 27th, he reported that he saw Jenny and Mrs. McNeil with another group of Indians who had by chance come across the McNeil cabin and took the two women as hostages. The two groups met and quarreled, and one of the warriors took a musket, shot Jenny in the chest, then scalped her and brandished her scalp. Burgoyne heard of the murder on the evening of July 27th and was deeply shocked and upset by it. On July 28th, he went to the Indian camp to admonish the chiefs about such atrocities, but he also had to pardon the warrior because he still needed the Indian support. Well, that didn't satisfy either the British, his troops, or the Indians. Pardoning was not part of the the British thought processes. Over the years, the story of Jenny's death took on huge mythology, and the story was used for propaganda purposes, for recruitment and for revenge. It is said that every time the story got told, Jenny got more beautiful and her hair got longer. But when you look at actual data, the large number of men who joined General Warner and General Stark actually joined those two American forces 3 or 4 days before the scalping of Jenny. But it fit into the story nicely, and certainly for propaganda purposes after the Saratoga campaign continued. Reaching Fort Edward strained Burgoyne's supply lines. He had to make another decision at that point as to where to cross the Hudson River. But since the river at Albany was considerably deeper, he made the decision to cross at a place called Stillwater. General Schuyler had withdrawn his forces from Stillwater on August 10th and moved to a couple of islands just north of the confluence of the Mohawk River and the Hudson River, about 9 miles north of Albany. Burgoyne crossed the Hudson River on the 13th and began a 3-day march, to a place called Bemis Heights, where there was a fortified American position. But fateful events had already occurred to the east and to the west. From Burgoyne's perspective, the campaign was a success. And he expected to be in Albany by the end of August, and that Barry St. Ledger, with a diversionary force from the Mohawk River, would join him there. He camped at Castleton, Vermont, and von Riedesel and his dragoons noted that they were without horses, since they needed horses and oxen to pull the horse carts. And Riedesel proposed a raid into Vermont, or as it was known at that time, the Hampshire Grants. The raid would march from the Battenkill to Arlington, gather Royalist forces, and proceed to Manchester and Rockingham. And there the soldiers would descend the Connecticut River to Brattleboro and return by the Great Road from Boston to Albany over the Great Road. So in effect, this would be like a flank move around. The goals of this move were to gather Royalists to join, disrupt Patriot activities, obtain supplies, gather horses and cattle and carriages. Burgoyne hoped to make the Patriots believe that he was a threat to New England. 2 fatal errors, however, doomed the raid. The first was the composition of the column, which was 486 men, consisting of 230 German troops, 206 provincial and Royalist troops, 50 regular British troops, and approximately 100 Indians. The second was the selection of Colonel Friedrich Baum, a dragoon, as the commander. He had little command experience and no knowledge of the country and the mission's requirements. The column left Fort Edward on August 9th. After they left, Burgoyne changed the route and the mission when he received intelligence that the rebels had a large magazine of weapons and powder in Bennington, Vermont. The column had reached Cambridge, New York, and had overwhelmed a small rebel force on the 12th, and they captured 1,000 bushels of wheat and 140 cattle. The ease of this encouraged Baum to propose marching a few more miles to Bennington on the next day and attack the reported 1,000-man post there and its 2,000 cattle and 300 horses. Now, that force at Bennington was commanded by John Stark, who had vast combat experience in the French and Indian Wars as a British officer and as an officer with Rogers Rangers. In 1775, he sided with the Patriots and became commander of the 1st New Hampshire Line and led this regiment at Bunker Hill. In 1776, he led the 5th Continental Infantry in the Canada invasion. The 5th became the 1st Continental New Hampshire, which he then commanded at Trenton and at Princeton with George Washington. He was passed over for promotion to brigadier general by the Continental Congress, and so he resigned in disgust in March of 1777 and returned to the Hampshire Grants. He despised the Continental Congress, was contemptuous of most of his colleagues, and especially detested General Philip Schuyler. He personified, however, the virtues and flaws of the frontiersmen in New England and was a natural leader. In June of 1777, the political leaders in the Hampshire Grants declared it to be a new independent commonwealth named Vermont, with a revolutionary new constitution, the first in North America to ban slavery. So we went from 13 colonies to 12 colonies in one commonwealth. They will rejoin later. Now that was in June. On July 18th, 1777, the new commonwealth made this man, John Stark, brigadier general of the Commonwealth's militia. That was on the 18th. The next day, on the 19th, 221 men had enlisted for 2 months of active duty. By July 24th, a few days later, almost 1,500 men and officers had enrolled to fight with Stark. By July 30th, Stark's brigade was marching to the Connecticut River. Now, many of Stark's men were veterans of the 7 Years' War, were good marksmen, were physically conditioned to frontier life, were undisciplined, but were courageous. In addition to Stark's brigade, Seth Warner, from the Battle of Hubbardton, and his reinforced regiment of Continentals were also in Manchester, Vermont, after the Battle of Hubbardton. The leaders of Burgoyne's foray, Frederick Baum and Heinrich Bremen, had poor intelligence, were poorly equipped for irregular warfare, and had a poor understanding of the environment. The American plan under Stark and Seth Warner was to threaten Burgoyne's line of communication and supply. But the impatient Stark decided to move his men to Bennington, which was about halfway between Manchester and Stillwater, New York, where General Schuyler was still located. On August 14th, while Stark was getting ready to move again, he received intelligence that an enemy column was approaching Bennington. Stark immediately sent orders for Warner to come up to Bennington with his force. Stark had sent a force of 200 men ahead to deal with Indian raids. And it was that force on the morning of August 14th that had made contact with Baum's column at a place called Van Schaik's Mill. They had fired a volley, destroyed a bridge, and retreated, leaving the flour, wheat, and salt and the cattle for Baum to capture. Loyalist forces joined the column, Baum's column at this point, bringing his total force up by about almost 200 men. Baum had continued to advance where Stark's force was camped about 4 miles west of Bennington. The two forces stopped at that point and eyed each other. Baum had heard the Americans would attack when reinforcements arrived, and so he decided to fortify his position and sent for reinforcements from Burgoyne. Baum occupied a steep hill 300 feet above the Walloomsac River. A force of 90 Loyalists arrived and increased his strength to about 700, including the Indians. Stark also received about 400 reinforcements, increasing his force size to about 2,000. Rain on the 15th allowed Baum to defend a large perimeter with a log redoubt and a 3-pounder cannon. The Loyalists built a second redoubt across the river. 4 houses near the river were fortified and occupied, and Baum's best hope was to hold out until reinforcements arrived from Burgoyne. Seth Warner arrived ahead of his regiment. He and Stark decided to employ the most difficult tactic available to them, a double envelopment. They intended to encircle Baum's position and attack front, rear, and both flanks simultaneously. Daunting enough for experienced veterans, Stark's untrained militia would pull this maneuver off flawlessly. At 3 p.m., men from the flanking units attacked across open ground behind the redoubt, while men from the main assault charged, firing from the cover of rocks and trees. Stark's main body rolled forward with its frontal assault. The provincials abandoned their redoubt after firing one volley. The Canadians in the houses and the Indians fled without offering any resistance. The Patriots, some of whom had infiltrated the defenses, spread panic. The defenders were unprepared to resist this tactic. For 2 hours, Baum's regulars and his dragoons repulsed the attackers until their powder wagon exploded. Baum and his dragoons then made a desperate attempt to break out by charging with their heavy sabers and bayonets. Baum fell mortally wounded, and with that, the survivors surrendered. Burgoyne had received Baum's request for support on the evening of August 15th. By 8 a.m. on the 15th, evening of the 14th. By 8 a.m. on the 15th, Colonel Heinrich Bremen and approximately 700 Germans with 2 cannon had been sent out to reinforce Baum. The march was slow due to the poor roads, and the column got lost. By afternoon on the 16th, they had reached the Van Schaik Mill, where the first engagement had occurred. They did not hear any gunfire, even though they were only 2 miles away from Baum. About 1,000 yards from the bridge up the road, a large party of men were occupying the heights along the road. Initially, Bremen thought they were Loyalists, but then realized that they were the Americans. Firing from the heights, Stark's men inflicted disproportionate casualties, but repeated advances against the Germans on the road failed to dislodge the Germans. Meanwhile, Seth Warner's Green Mountain men arrived after marching from Manchester. They and some of Stark's force engaged Bremen's force on the road. The fight was briefly equal, but by then the Germans had exhausted their ammunition and their cannon were useless. Bremen ordered a retreat, which became a rout, and darkness ended the fighting. Even Grandma Moses has painted this battle. The result of the raid was a disaster for Burgoyne, who lost 1,000 men, which was 1/7 of his army, compared to the fewer than 200 casualties for the Americans. There was also the capture of arms, muskets, and field artillery. Burgoyne's losses were mostly regular troops who had been beaten by a newly raised and untrained militia. This was a boon to American morale at a critical time in the Revolution's history. The defeat also discouraged Loyalists from committing themselves to Burgoyne's army. The success at Bennington was the result of audacity and fortune. Burgoyne had sent the wrong kind of force led by men who made wrong tactical decisions. Stark's move to Bennington without the enemy knowing it was by chance. The foul weather favored the Americans. The double envelopment movement should have failed an untrained force, but was textbook instead. Warner's arrival was at the time Bremen's force ran out of ammunition. On October 4th, the Continental Congress reversed its decision and rewarded Stark with his Brigadier General's commission. It's at the Bennington Museum. The Bennington Museum has a statue of Seth Warner in front of the monument. The monument for the Battle of Bennington is not on the battlefield, but is 4 miles away from it in Vermont. The battle actually occurs in New York State. But it's an impressive monument, 306 feet tall, and it's a great place to see in the fall as the leaves change. Now, all this went on to the east. Things were also going on west of Burgoyne's position. As I said before, the Hudson River is a tidal river up to several miles north of Albany, where the Mohawk River joins it. And the Mohawk arises northeast of Rome, New York, and flows east. A different Wood Creek arises in the same area and flows west into Oneida Lake, which then empties into the Oswego River and empties into Lake Ontario. There's a level 1 mile portage between the two streams, and this was known as the Great Carrying Place for the Indians. The Oneida Indians possessed it, and it was essential in controlling access to the northwest frontier. Now, the country between the upper Hudson River and Lake Erie was the home of the Iroquois Confederacy, or the Six Nations. The Six Nations being the Mohawks, the Onondagas, the Oneidas, the Cayugas, the Senecas, and the Tuscaroras. Now, those of you who are natives down here in North Carolina say, wait a minute, the Tuscaroras are North Carolinians. That's true. However, in the 1700s, early 1700s, as North Carolina got settled, the Tuscaroras were driven out of North Carolina, and they migrated north, and they were adopted by the Iroquois Nation. So the Tuscaroras are part of the Iroquois Nation in New York State. Now, the Tuscaroras will get their revenge because during the Civil War, a company was recruited from the Tuscarora Indians, and they came down to North Carolina and fought the Confederates in their native homeland down here. So it's a funny thing how history flips sometimes. The Iroquois Nation numbered about 12,000 people. The Iroquois had prevented the French and the Huron Indians from flanking the British in North America during the French and Indian Wars. In 1772, half of New York State, from 2 miles west of Schenectady to somewhere out going towards the lake, was separated from what was originally just Albany County. And this became Tryon County. So there were two counties in New York State at that time. During the Revolution, Tryon was divided equally, roughly, and occupied by patriots, royalists, and neutrals. Sir John Johnson tried to organize the Valley's loyalists and the Indians. When the patriots decided to arrest them, Sir John fled to Canada and raised the King's Royal Regiment, which will be part of the force that will come down to reinvade New York from Montreal. During the French and Indian Wars, Fort Stanwix had been built to guard the carrying place. The fort had been pretty much abandoned after the end of the French and Indian Wars. But General Schuyler, in June of 1776, informed Congress and General Washington that he intended to take Fort Stanwix and rebuild it, and this continued on and off into mid-1777. In the undertaking, this is the fort today, by the way. It's been, it was rebuilt and then was maintained as a local landmark. And then New York State got involved. And this is a fort that is, living historians are there all year long. So you can go there in the winter and during the day, at least. They don't sleep in the fort at night. But during the day, you can go to the fort and they'll be cooking meals there, and snow will be on the ground. It sits in the middle of Rome, New York. So you can see the cars in the background. Now, in undertaking this three-pronged attack that the British set up, the attack from down the Mohawk River was considered a diversionary force that would take manpower away from Burgoyne's army. But the British also understood that the Mohawk was the gateway to an extensive interior region whose importance would rival the Champlain-Hudson region. More pressing was the need to reestablish the loyalty of the Six Nations, two of whom were refusing to actively support their traditional allies, the British, and one, the Oneidas, who were actively supporting the Patriots. A British victory in the valley would guarantee the fidelity of the Six Nations and the support of the Loyalists in the valley, and perhaps encourage those neutrals to join the Loyalists. Lieutenant Colonel Barry St. Ledger was in the 34th Regiment. He was given the local rank of brigadier. It'd be like a brevet rank. His force would include 200 regulars, Sir John Johnston's regiment of 300 Loyalists, 70 Rangers, 80 Jaegers, German Jaegers, 40 artillerymen, 150 provincials, and 600 Indians. Artillery was 2 6-pounders, 2 3-pounders, and 4 Coehorn mortars. On July 23rd, while only 70 miles from Montreal, he learned that his column had been discovered and reported, but he decided to continue and move more quickly rather than wait for reinforcements. Well, the Continental troops that garrisoned Fort Stanwix, defense of the settlers in the Mohawk Valley fell to the Tryon County Militia, which was commanded by Brigadier General Nicholas Herkimer. Men in the valley, however, were divided in their loyalties, and many did not trust Herkimer. On July 29th, while Burgoyne was at Crown Point, General Schuyler wrote to Herkimer that a British force and Sir John Johnston were at Oswego and planned to attack Fort Stanwix. Herkimer was ordered to ready the militia to support the fort on short notice. Schuyler also informed the fort's commander, Colonel Gainsford at Stanwix, of the impending attack, and that Gainsford should provide the earliest intelligence to Herkimer when the enemy approached. The Oneida Indians, however, had already warned the fort about the approaching enemy. Gainsford sent out a detail of men to fell trees and block Wood Creek, the approach up Wood Creek. On July 28th, it took 200 men from Fort Dayton, which is farther down the Mohawk Valley, and sent them to reinforce at Stanwix. The fort's artillery consisted of 4 3-pounders, 4 6-pounders, and 3 9-pounders. So the fort actually had more artillery than the attacking force. It had taken 110 men 9 days to clear the obstructions in Wood Creek, but finally on August 3rd, roughly the same time frame that the Bennington raid is taking shape, St. Ledger's force surrounded the fort. Gainsford refused the request to surrender. On that same afternoon, St. Ledger received intelligence that General Herkimer, with a force of 800 to 900 men in a relief column, would be about 10 miles from Fort Stanwix that very night. On August 5th, St. Ledger sent a force of 400 Indians and the light infantry under General John to ambush Herkimer's column. So Fort Dayton is roughly down where, if you know anything about New York State, Canajoharie is. So they were leaving from Fort Dayton. Herkimer's column was leaving Fort Dayton, traveling to arrive at Fort Stanwix. There's a Oriskany Creek that comes in at this point. And it's about 3 or 4 miles from Fort Stanwix to Oriskany Creek. On the morning of August 6th, Herkimer sent 2 messengers to Colonel Gainsford about the relief column, and he asked the garrison to cooperate with an attack simultaneously. Gainsford was to signal with 3 cannon shots to indicate his willingness. Herkimer did not hear any shots from the fort. He wanted to wait, but his officers favored an immediate advance. After arguing, Herkimer yielded and gave the order to march. He took the lead of a double column of 600 men, followed by a 200-man rear guard. Oneida scouts were in the lead, but Herkimer had poor march security. About 6 miles from the fort, the road crossed a broad ravine about 50 feet deep with steep banks. You can walk the trail today. This is the bottom of the ravine. But when you look to your right and left, this is pretty much what you see. And it probably was like that at the time of the battle also. Sir John had placed the light infantry on the western end of the ravine and the Indians on the flanks in a semicircle. The infantry would check the advance of the column while the Indians closed the circle around the rear guard. The Indians sprang the trap too early to surround the rear guard, which promptly fled anyway. Some Indians chased the rear guard for several miles, killing some of them, but the 200 men in the rear guard disappeared. Surrounded, Herkimer was wounded in the leg early in the battle when his horse was killed. He sat under a beech tree. Famous painting that is in the Utica Public Library. He sat under a beech tree smoking his pipe, directing the battle and encouraging his men. The fighting was close quarters, often hand to hand. Indians would rush forward with tomahawks after a militiaman had fired his musket and could not reload quickly. After 3/4 of an hour, a cloudburst occurred and the fighting stopped to protect their powder, keep their powder dry. Sir John sent for reinforcements during this lull, and St. Ledger sent 70 more men. During the lull, however, Herkimer moved his men to a more defensible position. He instructed his men to fight 2 to a tree, one keeping his musket aimed while the other loaded, to defend against tomahawk attacks. Meanwhile, at the fort, the garrison had noted that the Indians were leaving the area and didn't know exactly how to interpret that. Just then, Herkimer's messengers finally arrived. Gainsford ordered the 3 cannon shot signal. He then dispatched 250 men with a field piece to rendezvous with the militia. However, when the column was about a half mile away from the fort, they came across the near-empty camp of Sir John and the Indians. The sortie to coordinate with Herkimer was forgotten, and the troops decided to raid the abandoned camp, destroying all the provisions. They brought off 50 brass kettles, muskets, tomahawks, spears, ammunition, clothing, blankets, and 5 stands of colors, which will run up the fort's flagpole. They also took personal letters that were in material left by St. Ledger and Sir John. Indian prisoners told of the troops about the ambush of Herkimer's force. Simultaneously, when the colonial force came across the abandoned camp and started looting it, and instead of going to the aid of Herkimer, some of the fleeing Indian women fled to where the Indians were fighting at the Battle of Oriskany and told them about the raid on the camp. Well, the Indians then began to abandon the battlefield and return back to their camp, followed by Sir John's men. Herkimer's men were so badly mauled that they did not pursue, and in fact, they collected their wounded and marched back to Fort Dayton. Herkimer's leg was amputated, but he died of wounds on August 16. Now, the Battle of Herkimer was perhaps the bloodiest battle of the Revolution in view of the number of casualties compared to the number of men involved, with 300 to 400 casualties among the colonists and more than 100 among the loyalists. 80% of the white men in Tryon County were engaged in this fight, fighting each other. The Iroquois also gave the battle significant mythical significance. For the first time in the history of the Iroquois nation, the Indian tribes were fighting against each other. They had been unified up to this point, and a high number of the casualties among the Indians were among chiefs of the Indians. This had psychological ramifications. On the day after the battle, there was some exchange of light artillery fire, and on August 8th, there were attempts to again convince the fort to surrender. There was a veiled threat of Indian raids on the unprotected homes of the fort's defenders. Shelling over the next several days did nothing to the fort's fabric. So a decision was made to approach the fort by sapping, that is, by building trenches, run a mine under the most formidable bastion of the fort, which was about 350 yards away, and then blowing it up. Meanwhile, while this was going on, General Schuyler, who was retreating before Burgoyne's army, did not forget what was happening at Fort Stanwix. And he sent this man, again, Major General Benedict Arnold, to command operations on the Mohawk and relieve the fort. Arnold left immediately on August 13th, arrived at Fort Dayton on August 20th, and learned that St. Ledger had 700 men and an Indian force of perhaps 1,000. Arnold's force consisted of 933 men, and although those men, plus Gainsworth's men in the fort, would be a combined strength of maybe 1,700 men, mostly Continental soldiers, he was uncharacteristically cautious and sought more support before attempting to lift the siege of the fort. Then Arnold resorted to psychological warfare ploy that had few parallels in American history. Local patriots had uncovered a loyalist plot and had arrested a number of men, including a mentally deficient eccentric named Hans Just Schuyler, no relationship to General Schuyler. His brother was condemned to death, but the family pleaded for his life. Arnold promised to spare both men if Hans Just, whom the Indians, because of his mental retardation, and he may have had a seizure disorder also, but the Indians felt that he had a connection with the supernatural. And so they convinced him to go to the Indian camp and exaggerate the size of Arnold's force. Hans Just readily agreed. Bullets were shot through his clothing to add realism to his escape story. The Indians knew Arnold was recruiting Oneidas, and they believed Youth's story that Arnold's Indians were as numerous as the leaves on the trees. St. Leger's Indians, hearing this, were disheartened by the bloody battle of Oriskany, the loss of their supplies and weapons, and the paucity of loot and scalps. They now decided this was a good excuse to go home. When St. Leger met with the chiefs, the returned warriors had already deserted. On August 22nd, St. Leger retreated quickly to Oswego, leaving behind most of his supplies and equipment. Arnold was 2 miles from the fort when he heard of St. Leger's withdrawal. He pushed his men to pursue the retreat. When they reached Oneida Lake, the British were already crossing it in boats. And at this point, this was the 225th commemoration of the Battle of Oriskany, another monument there. And this plaque nowadays might be a plaque that might be considered politically incorrect. But at this point, we'll stop. I'll answer any questions that you may have, and we'll next month talk about the two battles that actually occur, the retreat at Saratoga and the conclusion of the Saratoga campaign and some of the unusual things that occur with it, and the significance then of the failure of the Saratoga campaign for the British. Thank you. Anyone have any questions? Next time we'll have. Okay. It'll all be there. Yeah. Okay.
So that'll be the good thing. And then these pictures will be much bigger. It'll look a lot nicer, and you'll start on time. So, thank you for all of your technical help.
I think there are snacks there for people.
Yes.